She didn't see it coming. Nobody did. 1 second she was doing her job, calm, professional, the way she had done it for 11 years. The next, she was on the floor, shoved, thrown down in the aisle of a moving aircraft by a man who had decided, somewhere between his third drink and touchdown, that the rules simply did not apply to him. But here is the part nobody talks about. The part that turned this from a disturbing incident into something that shocked the entire country. The cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped out. What happened in the next 4 minutes inside that cabin, on American Airlines Flight 5039, taxiing toward the gate at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, was captured on a passenger's phone. That footage would be seen by millions. It would spark a national debate about safety, authority, and what it truly means to protect the people in your care. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly who was on that plane. Because this story isn't just about one violent moment. It's about what pushed a perfectly ordinary flight to the edge of something far more dangerous. And why the one person nobody expected was the only one willing to stop it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, think about this for a second. What kind of man gets on a plane, orders drink after drink, and then, the moment wheels touch ground, decides he is above every rule, keeping that cabin safe? What made him ignore not one warning, not two, but every single attempt by a trained professional to protect the people around him? And why, out of every person on that aircraft, was it the pilot who had to be the one to stop him? Those questions have answers, and every single one of them is more disturbing than you think. It was July 21st, a Thursday morning. American Airlines Flight 5039, a short regional hop from Lexington, Kentucky, down to Charlotte Douglas International Airport in North Carolina. Less than an hour in the air. The kind of route where nobody expects anything to go wrong, because nothing ever does. The cabin was quiet the way short flights always are. Business travelers buried in laptops. A couple sharing earbuds. An older gentleman in the window seat watching clouds thin out as the plane descended. Ordinary. Forgettable. Just another Thursday in the air. At the front of that cabin stood a woman named Cara. 11 years as a flight attendant. She had worked red-eyes and holiday rushes and diverted flights. She had held the hand of a woman who went into labor at altitude and talked a grown man through his first panic attack somewhere over Tennessee. Calm was not just her personality. It was her profession. She had earned it one difficult flight at a time. A few rows back sat a 25-year-old man named Troy. He had boarded that morning in high spirits, almost too high. He had ordered his first drink before the plane reached cruising altitude. Then a second, then a third. 3 Jack Daniels on a flight shorter than most lunch breaks. By the time the captain announced their descent into Charlotte, Troy was not the same man who had boarded in Lexington. His knee bounced. His jaw was tight. He kept checking the aisle like it owed him something. The calm around him and the storm building inside him were heading toward the same moment, and that moment was almost here. The wheels came down. The runway rushed up. And the moment the landing gear screamed against the tarmac, Troy stood up. Not at the gate. Not after the seatbelt sign clicked off. Right there, mid-taxi, while the aircraft was still moving at speed along the runway with 143 people strapped into their seats following every rule they had been told to follow. The seatbelt sign was still on. Every passenger on that plane knew it. Troy knew it too. Cara saw him rise and moved toward him immediately. No hesitation, the way you only move when you have done this before and you know exactly how these moments can turn. "Sir, I need you to take your seat. We have not reached the gate." Her voice was steady, professional, the tone that says this is not a request without ever raising its volume. Troy did not sit down. He looked at her the way some people look at a stop sign they have decided does not apply to them. "I'm getting off this plane," he said. Flat. Certain. Like the conversation was already over. "Sir, I don't care. I'm getting off." Other passengers began to notice. Heads turned. A man 3 rows back slowly lifted his phone. Someone whispered to the person beside them. The atmosphere inside that cabin had shifted in the way that air shifts before a storm. Not loud yet. Not violent yet. but charged with the specific tension of knowing something is about to go wrong and being unable to stop it. Kara tried again. Calm, firm, doing everything exactly right. And Troy took one step forward into the aisle. If you are still watching, drop a comment right now. Because what happens next is the part nobody saw coming. Kara moved to block him. Not aggressively. She positioned herself the way a professional does, creating a boundary with her presence, giving him every last chance to make the right choice before this became something it could not come back from. He looked at her, and then he shoved her. Not a nudge, not a stumble. He threw his hands forward and drove her backward, and Kara hit the floor of that cabin hard, in front of every passenger on that aircraft, in front of phones that were already recording, in a space where there was nowhere to look away. The sound of it, the gasp that erupted through that cabin, was the sound of 140 people realizing simultaneously that this was no longer a delay. This was no longer a difficult passenger. This was a crime, happening in real time, at 30 miles an hour, on a moving aircraft. She was on the floor. 11 years. Every difficult flight, every nervous passenger she had steadied, every moment she had held that cabin together through turbulence and fear and uncertainty, and now she was on the ground, hurt, because a man with 3 whiskeys in him had decided she was an obstacle. Think about that for a moment, because I want you to really sit with it. If that was someone you loved on that floor, your mother, your wife, your sister, what would you have felt in that instant? What would you have done? Would you have stayed in your seat? Or would something in you have refused to look away? The cabin was silent in the way that only shock produces. Not peaceful, not calm, but hollow. Frozen, because everyone was waiting for someone to act. Nobody moved. Nobody, except one person. The cockpit door opened. That is not supposed to happen during taxi. That door, reinforced, locked, the most secure boundary on any commercial aircraft, exists for a reason. Once a plane is in motion, the pilots stay in. That is the rule. That is the protocol that keeps flights safe and crews protected and passengers alive. But Captain Willis had heard everything. And Captain Willis had made a decision. He stepped out of that cockpit and into the cabin, and the air changed immediately. This was not another passenger. This was not a crew member trying to manage the situation with words. This was the man responsible for every life on that aircraft. And he was not carrying a form or a warning or a polite request. He was carrying something much simpler. Enough. Troy turned to face him. And even in the state he was in, 3 drinks deep, adrenaline running, convinced he was the most important person on that aircraft, something in him registered that this was different. He looked at the pilot. And then, with a level of recklessness that is almost difficult to comprehend, he pointed at Captain Willis and said, "I will break your jaw." The pilot did not flinch. "I don't care what you want to do," Captain Willis said. "You're going to take a seat right now." Troy turned back toward Kara. "You're going to let me by." That was the last thing he said as a free man on that aircraft. Because Captain Willis moved. Fast, decisive, no hesitation. He grabbed Troy, drove him down into the aisle, and pinned him face down against the floor of the cabin with his hands locked behind his back. And then, in a voice the entire cabin heard, he said the words that millions of people would replay. "You don't put your hands on my flight attendant." Troy did not stop fighting. Even face down, even pinned, even with a pilot holding him against the floor of a cabin full of witnesses. He kept struggling, kept kicking, kept making this as difficult as every other thing he had done since the wheels touched that runway. The co-pilot emerged from the cockpit seconds later. Together, they held him. A crew member grabbed a seatbelt strap, the kind that loops through overhead luggage brackets, and wrapped it around Troy's ankles to stop the kicking. This was not something out of a movie. This was improvisation under pressure by a crew that had no other choice. And for 20 minutes, 20 full minutes, Captain Willis stayed on that floor, holding him, waiting for police, not moving, not releasing, not letting the chaos have one more inch than it had already taken. Around him, the cabin was silent. Passengers sat motionless, phones still raised, the shock of what they had witnessed sitting heavy in the pressurized air. Some were crying. Some were staring. One woman near the back had not moved since Kara hit the floor. Kara herself was being helped by another crew member, still on the aircraft, in pain, trying to process what her body had just absorbed. What nobody knew yet, in those 20 minutes on the tarmac, was that her injuries were not minor. The physical therapy she would need in the weeks that followed was a quiet, private consequence of a moment that had lasted less than 4 seconds. For seconds that cost her weeks of recovery. When the police boarded that aircraft, Troy was still on the floor. They handcuffed him. He kept kicking. Officers had to call for backup before they could physically remove him from the cabin, a process that required multiple law enforcement personnel to manage one man who, hours earlier, had simply been a passenger on a 1-hour regional flight. The charges came fast, and they came hard. Federal charges, because what happens on a commercial aircraft is federal jurisdiction, and the government does not treat it lightly. Troy faced counts of being intoxicated and disruptive on an aircraft, assault on a female, communicating threats, and interference with the duties of a flight crew member. Combined, those charges carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and fines reaching $250,000. The cell phone footage, shot by a 23-year-old flight attendant from another airline who happened to be on board, spread across every platform within hours. Hundreds of thousands of views became millions. Comments flooded in from across the country, and the reaction was almost unanimous. The pilot was a hero. What he did, leaving that cockpit, hitting that floor, holding that man for 20 minutes, was the kind of instinctive, selfless courage that most people only believe exists in the movies. Here is the truth this story leaves behind. A plane is one of the few places left in modern life where the rules are absolute, where everyone, regardless of who they are or what they think of themselves, has agreed to surrender a small piece of control in exchange for safety. That agreement only holds when everyone honors it. Troy broke it, and Captain Willis restored it. Not with a policy, not with a form, with his body, on a floor, for 20 minutes. So ask yourself honestly, if you were in that cabin, in that seat, watching it happen, would you have been the one to move? Now we want to hear from you. Was Captain Willis a hero, or did he overstep? Was what Troy did worth 20 years of his life? Drop your verdict in the comments. Guilty, or something more complicated than that? And think about this before you scroll away. Kara went home that night bruised and shaken, starting weeks of physical therapy for 4 seconds she never saw coming. If you never want to miss a story like hers, one that stays with you, then you already know what to do. Subscribers heard about this one first. Don't be the last to find out what happens next. If you are still not subscribing, tell us why in the comments. We read every single one.